Dog saw her first. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. Not in the incident report, not in the administrative review, not in the carefully worded email that went out to department heads 3 weeks later. Everyone focused on what Corporal Hadley Voss said, and what she did, and what it cost her. But the dog decided before any of it happened. The dog looked up from where he was lying across the man's feet, ears flat, body still, and he watched Hadley walk down that hallway, and he did not growl. His name was Ghost. 11 years old, a Belgian Malinois with a graying muzzle and a scar that ran from his left shoulder blade down to his ribs, the kind of scar that tells a whole story without a single word. He'd served 2 tours in Kandahar with his handler, and he had the kind of stillness that came not from calm but from absolute discipline. The stillness of an animal that had learned to hold everything inside until the moment it mattered. His handler's name was Warrant Officer Dale Sheridan, retired, 53 years old, born in Truro, Nova Scotia, which he would tell you meant nothing except that he knew what cold felt like, and he'd spent most of his adult life trying to get further from it. He had served 26 years with the Canadian Armed Forces, Joint Task Force 2, and he had come back from places that didn't make the news with a body that worked and a mind that didn't. Not anymore, not the way it used to. Or he'd been admitted to the behavioral health unit at Santa Croix Regional Hospital on a Tuesday morning in November, which meant the hallways smelled like floor wax and burnt coffee, and the particular institutional sadness of a building that tries to look cheerful and doesn't quite manage it. He had not come willingly. His sister had driven him from Moncton 4 hours, and the entire way he had sat in the passenger seat with Ghost's head in his lap and said nothing. His sister, whose name was Pauline, and who worked as a claims adjuster, and who loved her brother in the helpless, exhausted way of people who have watched someone disappear slowly for years. Pauline had signed the admission papers because Dale would not touch the pen. He sat now in the chair beside his bed, not on the bed, because he would not put his back to the door with his feet off the ground. Ghost lay across his boots. The TV on the wall was on but muted. Dale had not spoken to the intake nurse, the admitting physician, or the orderly who had brought him a tray of food he had not touched. He had answered exactly 2 questions, his name and whether he had any allergies. Everything else he had let fall into the silence he'd built around himself like a structure, like something load-bearing. The unit coordinator, a man named Bryce, had flagged the file within the first hour. Because of Dale's silence, they had silent patients, but because of Ghost. The dog was certified. Hadley had confirmed this herself when she reviewed the intake paperwork on her break, sitting at the nursing station with her coffee going cold beside her. Ghost's certification was current, his vest was marked, his documentation was in order. Under the Accessible Canada Act and provincial accommodation guidelines, there was no ambiguity. Ghost stayed. Bryce didn't see it that way. "We have other patients with allergies," he said, standing in the doorway of the nursing station. "We have patients with phobias. We have a therapeutic environment to consider." Hadley was 29 years old and had been a registered nurse for 4 years, 3 of them on this unit. She had the kind of face that people described as open, wide-set brown eyes, a tendency to tuck her hair behind both ears when she was thinking, and she had learned early that people sometimes mistook openness for softness. She had stopped correcting them. It was more useful to let them think that. "His documentation is current and complete," she said. "Ghost is a certified psychiatric service animal under a federally recognized program. Removing him requires a documented clinical justification, not a general concern. Dr. Ambrose hasn't signed off on the animal remaining. Dr. Ambrose hasn't assessed the patient yet. That assessment is scheduled for tomorrow morning." She looked at Bryce. "Until there is a clinical determination that the animal presents a specific documented risk to a specific identified individual, he stays. That's not my opinion. That's the policy." Bryce looked at her for a long moment. "I'll be escalating this," he said. "I'd expect nothing less," she said. She went back to her paperwork. Her hands were steady. Her coffee was cold. What Bryce did not know, what very few people at Santa Croix knew, was that Hadley Voss had grown up in Petawawa, Ontario, in the kind of household that orbited a military posting the way moons orbit planets. Everything tilted toward it, everything shaped by its gravity. Her father had been a signals officer with 2 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group. Her older brother, Curtis, had followed him infantry, then a second contract, then a third. Curtis had come back from his last deployment, functional by every external measure and entirely hollowed out by every internal one, and for 2 years he had refused to talk to anyone, and for 6 months after that he had refused to leave his apartment. And for 1 terrible week he had stopped answering his phone. Hadley had driven from Ottawa to Petawawa alone in February, in the dark, doing 140 on the highway and not caring, because something in the silence of his phone felt like a particular kind of final. She had found him. He was fine, or as fine as he was. He'd fallen asleep with his phone dead and had not woken up when she pounded on the door, and had been deeply confused, and then deeply embarrassed when she came through the window she'd pried open with a tire iron. They had stood in his kitchen at 2 a.m, both of them slightly ridiculous, and something had broken open between them that had been sealed for years. Curtis was the one who'd told her about Ghost. Not this Ghost, the concept. The way certain dogs were trained not just as service animals but as anchors. The way a handler's nervous system learned to sync with the animals so that when the dog was calm, the brain had evidence, actual biological evidence, not a therapist's words, that the environment was safe. It's not about comfort, Curtis had told her. It's about data. The dog knows, and your body believes the dog. She thought about that now, walking down the hallway toward room 114, twice, which was protocol, and then opened the door, which was also protocol, and she said, "Mr. Sheridan, I'm Hadley. I'll be your nurse this shift." Standard introduction, nothing unusual, and Ghost lifted his head and looked at her, and did not growl. Dale did not look at her. He was looking at the muted television. She went about her tasks quietly, checked the vitals monitor, noted the untouched tray, did not comment on it. It was almost to the door again when she stopped, and she did something that was not exactly protocol but was not against it either. She crouched down, slowly, so that she was at Ghost's eye level. She did not reach toward him. She simply crouched there, and she looked at him, and she said, quietly and without particular inflection, 2 words in a sequence that any civilian would hear as meaningless noise. Repos, veil, rest, watch, French commands, Lee. Standard JTF2 working dog protocol for transitioning an animal from active alertness to passive monitoring, specific enough that only someone who'd spent time around that program would know the exact phrasing, the exact cadence. Ghost Coast's ears came up, then very slowly his head lowered back to Dale's feet, but his eyes stayed on Hadley. Dale Sheridan turned from the television for the first time since he'd arrived. He looked at her. She was still crouching. She met his eyes and did not look away and did not say anything. How do you know that command? Exactly. It was more like someone checking a perimeter. My brother, she said. Curtis Voss. He served with 3 RC. He talked about the working dog protocols. He talked about a lot of things. Eventually. She paused. It took a while for eventually to arrive. Dale looked at her for a long time. Ghost had not moved. He okay? Dale said finally. Brother. Better, she said. Not fixed. Better. Something shifted in Dale Sheridan's face. Not softening, exactly, but a reallocation of tension, weight moving from one place to another. They're going to try to take him, he said. He meant Ghost, the coordinator. He came in earlier. He's not going to take Ghost, Hadley said. You sound sure about that. I am sure about that. She stood up slowly, the way she'd crouched, no sudden movements. Ghost documentation is complete and current. Removing a certified psychiatric service animal without documented clinical cause isn't a policy preference. It's a rights violation. I've already noted that in your file. She paused, and I've sent a copy of the applicable provincial and federal guidelines to the unit director. Dale stared at her. You did that already? While you were being admitted, she said. I reviewed your paperwork during intake. He was quiet. Why? She considered the question. It deserved a real answer. Because it's the right thing to do, she said. And because I know what happens when someone like you loses the one thing that's keeping their nervous system regulated. I've seen what that looks like. I'm not going to let that happen on my shift if I can help it. She left him with that. She did not wait for a response. What she walked back into was considerably less tidy. Bryce had escalated as promised. The unit director, a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, efficient, careful, deeply protective of her unit's reputation, had been pulled out of a case review meeting. She was standing at the nursing station with a printout in her hand when Hadley arrived, and her expression was the expression of a person who is being very calm with some effort. "The guidelines you sent," Dr. Okafor said. "Hadley, you can't simply transmit policy documentation to my office without going through the chain of—" "I can note compliance requirements in a patient's file," Hadley said, "and I can flag those requirements to the relevant decision maker, which is what I did." She kept her voice level. "Has there been a clinical assessment determining that GHOST presents a specific risk to a specific patient or staff member?" "That's not the point." "It is the point," Hadley said. "Policy, it's the only point. Everything else is a preference. Preferences don't override rights." Dr. Okafor looked at the printout. She looked at Hadley. She was not a bad administrator. She was, in fact, a good one, which meant she knew when she was standing on weak ground. "I'll review the documentation," she said carefully. "I'd appreciate that," Hadley said. What happened over the next 48 hours was not dramatic in the way that most people imagine hospital dramas to be. There was no shouting, no confrontation in a corridor, no single explosive moment. It was instead a slow, grinding process of paperwork and counter-paperwork, of emails sent and responded to, of Bryce finding new concerns and Hadley documenting why each concern failed to meet the clinical threshold for restriction. Rook. She did this on her breaks, and she did it on her own time, and she did it with the methodical patience of someone who has been through institutional resistance before and has learned that persistence, properly documented, is a more effective weapon than anger. On the second evening, Dr. Ambrose, a psychiatrist in his early 60s who had the slightly distracted air of someone who has seen too many things go wrong and has made peace with that, completed his assessment of Dale Sheridan, for 90 minutes in room 114, which was unusually long. When he came out, he found Hadley at the nursing station. "The dog stays," he said without preamble. "I've written the clinical recommendation. I want it in the file." "It's already drafted," Hadley said. She slid the form across the counter. "I just needed your signature." Dr. Ambrose looked at the form. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that might have been amusement, or might have been relief. "How long have you been here?" he said. 4 years, she said. "You're very organized for someone who's been here 4 years." "I've had good reasons to be organized," she said. He signed the form. The formal complaint against Hadley came through on the 4th day. It was authored by Bryce and co-signed by 2 other staff members she knew only by sight. One from housekeeping, one from the administrative wing. And it alleged that she had acted outside her scope of practice, had created a conflict with unit administration, and had transmitted internal policy documentation without authorization. It was 4 pages long and had the particular quality of a document written in anger and edited into neutrality. Lee read it in the break room, alone, with a cup of tea that was still hot for once. She read it twice. Then she put it down and sat with it for a moment, because she was human and it was not a pleasant thing to read, and she was allowed to feel that. Then she pulled out her own documentation. She had kept records from the first shift. Every conversation with Bryce, time-stamped. Every policy citation she'd sent, with delivery confirmation. Every note she'd entered in Dale's file, which were nursing notes, and therefore part of the official medical record, and therefore not unauthorized transmission of anything. She had a copy of Dr. Ambrose's signed recommendation. She had a copy of GHOST's certification. She had a copy of the provincial accommodation guidelines, annotated in the margins in her small, precise handwriting. She did not feel powerful, exactly, or she felt tired. The way you feel tired when you have been right about something for several days, and the cost of being right keeps going up. But she had known this was possible, had known it when she first sent those guidelines to Dr. Okafor. And she had prepared for it anyway, because that was what you did. You prepared. You documented. You held the line. The review board convened 12 days after Dale Sheridan's admission. It was composed of the hospital's legal counsel, the patient rights officer, the director of nursing, and an external consultant from the provincial health authority. Hadley presented her documentation. Bryce presented his complaint. The 2 staff co-signatories did not attend. Patient rights officer, a quiet woman named Delphine Savard, who had been doing this work for 20 years and had the manner of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by what people do to other people inside institutions, asked Bryce a series of questions about the specific clinical risk assessment that had prompted his initial request to remove GHOST. Bryce referenced general concerns. She asked him which specific patient had reported an allergy. He named a patient, or she noted that this patient's file contained no allergy to animals. She asked him which specific patient had reported a phobia of dogs. He mentioned another name. She noted that this patient had been discharged 2 days before Dale Sheridan was admitted. The review lasted 3 hours. The finding was issued the following week. Hadley was at the nursing station when the email came through, on a Thursday morning between rounds. She read the subject line. She set her phone face down on the counter while she finished her round. She administered 2 medications, changed a dressing, sat for 6 minutes with a patient who was having a hard morning and needed someone to simply be present without trying to fix anything. Then she went back to the station and read the full email. The complaint had been dismissed. The review board had found that Hadley Voss had operated fully within her scope of practice, had complied with all relevant documentation requirements, had demonstrated exceptional adherence to patient rights protocols in a situation where institutional pressure may have inclined other practitioners toward a different course of action. They had also noted, and this was the part she read twice, that her conduct had brought to light a pattern of informal practice regarding service animal accommodation that does not align with current federal and provincial standards, and that the hospital's written policy on service animals would be revised accordingly, with mandatory training for all unit staff. She forwarded the email to Curtis without comment. He replied 17 minutes later with a single line, "Knew it." She smiled at that, alone at the nursing station, with bad coffee going cold beside her. On Dale Sheridan's last day on the unit, day 19, a Friday pale November light coming in sideways through the window, Hadley was doing his discharge review. Ghost was sitting beside the chair where Dale was signing paperwork, alert but relaxed, ears soft. There was a program, she'd told Dale 3 days earlier, a ranch outside Fredericton, run by a retired warrant officer and a veterinarian, specifically for handlers transitioning out of service. Horses, open land, a peer support group that met on Thursday evenings. He'd listened without responding. She hadn't pushed. "The ranch," he said now, without looking up from the forms. "You think it's worth it?" "I think it's one of the best programs in the province," she said. "I think they understand what you've been through in ways that most people here genuinely can't. I think Ghost would probably like the horses." Dale Sheridan looked at Ghost. Ghost was looking at Hadley. "Likes you," Dale said. It had the weight of a significant observation. "I know," she said. "I was flattered." He almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but it was close. The shape of a smile, the almost arrival of it, which, she had learned over 4 years on this unit, was sometimes the most that could be asked for, and was not nothing. "I'll call them," he said. "The ranch." "Good," she said. She finished the discharge paperwork. She walked him and Ghost to the elevator. She did not make a speech. She did not tell him it would be okay, because she didn't know that, and she didn't believe in offering assurances she couldn't support. She shook his hand, which he accepted, briefly, firmly, and she crouched one more time, just for a moment, at Ghost's level. The old dog looked at her with his yellow amber eyes. She didn't say anything, neither did he, but he pressed his graying muzzle briefly against her palm, warm and solid, before turning to follow his handler through the elevator doors. The doors closed. She stood in the hallway for a moment, alone. The unit hummed around her, call buttons, the distant sound of a television, the particular quality of light in a building that holds people's worst days, and sometimes, if everyone does their jobs, the first tentative days of what comes after. She went back to work.